Moving on to this 15-mark question. So, discuss methods of government intervention to protect consumers within utilities markets such as energy and telecommunications. So the two examples that are given us in the extract. Now, so what are some examples of government intervention, or as some of you may know it a bit better, what are some examples of regulation where the government or like the CMA can involve themselves in the market to regulate to protect consumers? And a few should pop into mind. This is of course part of the spec. It should be content knowledge you have revised. If you have not revised it, of course flashcards are available and revision notes on the udoecon.com website. But the main things that come to my mind are things like profit regulation, where a regulatory firm, where a regulator steps in and regulates a firm's profits, isn't used as much anymore since, of course, due to the entire concept of the profit incentive. If you reduce a firm's profit incentive, it makes them quite inefficient usually. But then other things like price regulation, of course, the classic, where the CMA regulates the price, as you can see in this extract here, where the price has been regulated, where it's falling from £19 to £12 now. Then other things such as how we can encourage small firms, things like reducing competition, deregulation. Why? Since there's a whole chain of analysis which can develop on that, where if we reduce the barriers to entry in markets such as energy and telecommunications, means new firms will enter the market. That increases the contestability in the market, thus increasing the levels of competition in the market, which leads to several benefits. And things like merger policy, or just providing like startups with the loans, things like that. So there's many different ones you can talk about here, but which are the ones I would pick here with regards to government intervention to protect consumers? Now, when protecting consumers, what is the main way consumers are being exploited in most of these markets? What is the main theme being of this extract? Of course, it's been with prices. So we want to stop consumers being exploited via prices. So how can we stop consumers being exploited via prices? Of course, the CMA can regulate them. And how can they regulate them specifically on price? What can we include there? We can include something like a maximum price, where with a maximum price, of course, it sets an upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers, thus meaning that they are no longer being exploited. So that's a good one paragraph you can speak about, where the CMA can, and then of course you'd add a lot of the chain of analysis, a lot of the detail of monopolies, where you can talk about these firms have this degree of monopoly power, they're able to exploit consumers, thus the CMA have to step in to protect consumers. They regulate the prices by setting a maximum price, thus meaning that consumers, of course, are no longer being exploited. There's many other points you can speak about here, things like stopping anti-competitive practices. So the CMA sometimes intervenes in markets to stop firms limit pricing, predatory pricing. Why? Of course, as the name suggests, these are anti-competitive practices. They stop new firms entering the market. So the CMA comes in and regulates them to stop incumbent large monopolies doing this. And other things like demerger policy, or stopping the merger occurring. Things like providing new startups with loans could also be used. But what would I pick for my paragraph points? Of course, the main paragraph point I am going to talk about is just CMA regulating. And if you think about the theme of the question talks about how we're going to protect consumers. What is the main way consumers are being exploited here? What has been the main theme of our extracts? Since if you look back to the question before, we're thinking about profits. So the main way consumers have been exploited in this extract is of course prices. That prices have risen too high, and why is that? Of course, since, and the way I'd link this to is BT / these type of energy telecommunication firms have monopoly power, and they use that monopoly power to exploit consumers. Thus the CMA has to regulate. They have to do some sort of price regulation, and the price regulation I would talk about, an appropriate policy we could use, is of course maximum prices. So we could set a maximum price, of course, says the upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers. Thus, if we set that maximum price below the equilibrium price, it means that consumers, you could say, are now no longer being exploited. This is a really good point to mention for your first paragraph. But another thing, like we mentioned earlier, another policy the CMA or the government could intervene and use is something like increasing the levels of competition in the market, and you may call this deregulation. So deregulation will mean firms can enter the market more easily. Why? Since there are less barriers to entry. Things like legal barriers, patents, copyrights, trademarks. If you get rid of things like this, especially in a market such as the energy market, if you get rid of things like the legal barriers, it can really help new starting firms to enter the market. And you can see how this chain of analysis will develop as it leads to better prices for consumers, maybe better quality for consumers. But now let's go into depth with these paragraphs and let's see how I would write these out. Let's get started on this first paragraph. And like I said, we're going to do it on maximum prices. And what else can we call a maximum price in terms of like energy markets? We could also call it a price cap. And for some of you that do know, RPI plus K, RPI minus X, that sometimes just pop up in extracts here or there. So that's a good thing to know, but it's not required knowledge. But with maximum prices, how we're going to show this on a diagram, I am actually going to draw two diagrams here. I'm going to draw one cost revenue diagram and one maximum price diagram, since I'm just going to add a bit more detail into why the CMA is regulated. So talk about how these firms in energy, in telecommunication markets, usually have this monopoly power. They can exploit consumers. Thus, it's necessary for the CMA to intervene in the market, the government intervention, to then stop this degree of monopoly power, stop these firms exploiting consumers. But anyway, let's get started with this maximum price or price cap diagram. So of course, it's just simple supply and demand diagram. Then where would we set a maximum price? And this is all to do with the equilibriums. So equilibrium currently is at PE and QE, but now we will actually not label QE for now. But why are we setting a maximum price? We are setting a maximum price since the price at equilibrium, the current price in the market is too high. Therefore, we want to set the new maximum price. The max price needs to be lower than the equilibrium price to have any effect. Since if we set the maximum price here, this will therefore mean what? It will mean that prices will still go back to equilibrium, meaning that it has no effect on the market. So we always set maximum prices below the equilibrium price level at P max, and let's see what this causes in the market itself. So we label this QS, and then we'll label this QD, and of course, since prices are lower than equilibrium, you could also comment on maybe an evaluation. This leads to excess demand. But that is the first diagram, and the second diagram, of course, is going to be simple cost revenue diagram. So back on with the paragraph. One method that the government can intervene to protect consumers is by setting maximum prices or a price cap. And the bit of application I'm going to include is way back to extract A, where we do talk about a price cap. Now, the government claimed that this price cap could save households up to £100 a year, and that is a bit of application I am going to use. So my chain of analysis now is going to go pretty much, I'm going to focus this paragraph on the energy market. So I'm going to talk about the big six, of course, in energy, things like firms like British Gas. British Gas has a market share of around 25%, which again would classify it as a legal monopoly. I'm just going to start off with mentioning how the British Gas has this monopoly power, therefore it can profit maximize where MC equals MR. Thus, what is the big thing about monopolies? They are price makers. That is what monopoly power is. They're price makers, thus can set their own price, and they use that price making power, that monopoly power, to therefore charge price PMAX, which is to consumers being exploited. As we know, if you want to show this on a diagram in monopolies also, this triangle here represents, what does it represent? It represents welfare loss due to monopolies profit maximizing. So you could also reference that in your extract. So I've given a bit of context on why the government need to intervene. Now I'm going to talk about how they intervene. So therefore, the CMA or government would intervene in this market by setting a maximum price. And then I'm going to reference this diagram a bit more. So then exactly how I walked you through it, I would go about it in that step-by-step manner. So the market originally is at equilibrium where PE meets QE. So at this point here, this is at the point where consumers are being exploited. Thus, so when the government intervened in the market, they would set the maximum price. They would make these firms charge a price lower than the equilibrium price, thus meaning that, of course, what effects would that mean? If now consumers are being charged lower prices, it means things like consumer surplus, consumer welfare would increase and improve. And thus, as a conclusion, basically, consumers are being exploited to a lesser degree. Why? Since prices are now lower. And one of the main things I've not mentioned yet is, of course, all this links into protecting consumers. It all links into allocative efficiency. And of course, with consumers being exploited, it is a massive degree of allocative inefficiency. But for those top level students, what you can actually do, you can show this price cap on the cost revenue diagram itself. So the way you do that is essentially what you do. The point at where we are allocatively efficient, which is of course where MC equals AR, at that point, all you do is draw a horizontal line that pretty much goes through that point and label it price. You can literally label it P cap, and that would be the point, and that would be our price cap. Why? Since of course that would solve the allocative inefficiency, since now firms are charging the allocatively efficient price, and it is a lower price, thus meaning consumers are no longer being exploited. So it's a really good thing to mention in these paragraphs, and a really bit of a good added detail you could mention here. And this also means this green triangle we've drawn of deadweight loss will also disappear, where we'd gain a bit of consumer surplus back, and then the deadweight loss would itself disappear. So it's a really good thing to mention, and a really substantiated, great argument here. Okay, so I've written most of that up, but now moving on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph, I am going to mention, of course, we're talking about price caps, And with price caps, a great one to always mention is regulatory capture. So like I said before, you can talk about RPI plus K, RPI minus X. There's some popular price caps. It's good information to know. But essentially, what does regulatory capture mean? It means that the regulator becomes fond of the firm they're regulating, and maybe they don't set the K too high or they set the X too low. So essentially, the price cap is not where it should be. So maybe this P cap here is not at the allocatively efficient price, as the regulator has fallen fond, therefore somewhere around here, thus of course limiting the positive effects to consumers, limiting the degree of allocative efficiency we gain, the consumer surplus, the consumer welfare that benefits. So the way I'd word it, however in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulatory capture, and then I will talk about how regulators, if they fall fond of the firms they are regulating, they may set K too high or X too low. And if you have no idea about what I mean by them, it's good to research these. So RPI plus K and RPI minus X. There's some good price caps just for a bit of added knowledge to research. And of course, another great evaluation point you could mention is what we're assuming here. And remember, always think about the assumptions we're making. The big one is that British Gas will be profit maximizing. You could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on a business objectives. As a business, they could be profit satisfying, for example, thus reducing the degree to which they are actually exploiting consumers. Since if they're profit satisfying, they could actually be charging closer to that allocatively efficient price, thus meaning the degree to which consumers are exploited or the degree to which a maximum price will improve consumer welfare is limited. And I don't want to overload here too much with the valuation, since of course you will not need 3 evaluation points per paragraph, but the reason for a lot of these videos is just revision. So of course, for different questions, not all of these evaluation points will be relevant, but maybe 1 or 2 of them will be. Therefore, you can apply these evaluation points you've learned, you've revised to different questions. So another evaluation point for this, of course, is we're talking about government regulation, and whenever the government intervene in the market, there will also always be a degree of government failure. It's a great one to mention. You can talk about how the government could have, the opportunity cost of the government introducing a maximum price here. Of course, there's lots of admin costs associated with the government setting this maximum price. Have they actually improved the conditions in the market? Are we now at the socially optimum point? And is there better policies we could have used instead of setting a maximum price here? So it depends on the degree of government failure. So the way I'd word it is, however in evaluation, this depends on the degree of government failure, as the government would have dedicated significant admin costs, significant time to implementing this maximum price, and it may not be at the socially optimum point, it may not be at the best point for society, thus meaning that the government have intervened trying to improve the allocation of resources, but it's actually overall led to a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's how I'd evaluate this paragraph, and now let's move on to the second paragraph. Moving on to the second paragraph, and this paragraph is all going to be about how the government can intervene to protect consumers via, and this one way the CMA/the UK government does it, they increase competition within the market. And how can we increase competition within a market? We can do that by a concept called deregulation. How does deregulation increase competition within the market? As deregulation, for example, if we're reducing regulation, this links entirely to barriers to entry. It means the barriers to entry within the market are lower, and if the barriers to entry within the market are lower, this means there's increased contestability, and if there's increased contestability, what does that mean? It means it's easier for firms to enter the market, thus this should and this will lead to an increased level of competition, as it's easier for firms to now enter the market. A specific example you can give with regards to the telecommunication industry is radio licenses. So they're called radio spectrum licenses, and essentially all the big firms buy them, and this is how essentially the mobile networks work within the UK. But one way the government can help new entrants enter the market, make it easier for new firms to enter the market, which of course we'll explain later on why it helps, why it protects consumers. But one way the government can intervene to help this out is they can allocate some radio spectrum licenses specifically for new entrants. As usually what happens is that the big incumbent firms like Vodafone, EE, they essentially end up buying up all these radio spectrum licenses, and new firms don't even get a chance. So the one way the government can intervene in the market is allocating some just to new entrants, which would of course lower barriers to entry, thus increase the levels of competition within the market. So we've ended that chain of analysis saying more competition. But what does more competition actually mean? And let's try to be as step by step as possible, squeeze as many marks, as much information from this chain of analysis as possible. So more competition will mean there's more firms competing in the market. And what does that mean? It means there's more firms competing for customers. And if there's more firms competing for customers, let's think about the new entrants versus the existing firms, so the incumbent firms. This means the new firms will be essentially stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, since these new entrants will enter the market, maybe set a lower price and steal customers away from these incumbent firms such as Vodafone, such as O2, such as EE. So let's try and look at the cost revenue diagram now of an incumbent firm when the government deregulates the industry and it means that more firms enter the market. So of course we have a normal just monopoly diagram, D equals AR, so let's just quickly label this up, D equals AR, MR, MC. We have this box of super profit, of course, Qmax and Pmax. But now, what do we say? So that new firms will enter the market and steal these incumbent firms' demand away. So they're stealing customers. So how can we represent that on the diagram? Of course, that is going to be shown by your demand curve shifting inwards. Since why? If other firms are stealing your demand, this means demand will, of course, decrease. And same thing with MR. So now, let's see the effect on price this has. So let's see the effect this has on price. So price will now go from Pmax to Pmax1, and of course a lower quantity as well. So why do you think this is? This is because new entrants are entering the market, they're stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, therefore these incumbent existing firms now are forced to lower prices to remain competitive within the market. Now, what is the aim of this question? What we're trying to actually answer in this question, we're trying to answer whether government intervention can protect consumers, and of course by firms now being forced, these existing incumbent firms, these oligopolistic firms being forced to lower their prices, this would therefore, we would say this is protecting consumers. Why? Since if you think about concepts like consumer surplus, allocative efficiency, with lower prices, we are definitely improving the consumer surplus in this market. So yes, you could conclude this paragraph by saying, yes, by government intervening, by them deregulating, new firms will enter the market, steal existing firms' demand away, thus causing these existing firms to be forced to lower their prices to remain competitive, thus meaning overall the outcomes for consumers would be better. Why? Since prices are lower, thus an increase in consumer surplus. Another massive thing you could comment on, of course, you can comment on productive efficiency, but also these large incumbent firms have these boxes of supernova profit. What you could also mention is that these new firms entering the market, this new competition, this new competitive drive forces these incumbent firms to reinvest more of their supernova profit into research and development, thus increasing the degree to which these incumbent firms are now dynamically efficient, as they're almost being forced to innovate to maintain their competitive edge, to maintain their market position, to maintain their market power. They have to spend more, they have to allocate more of their supernova profit into research and development to, like we said, to maintain that market share they have, to maintain that market power. And why is this level of competition positive for consumers? As when these incumbent firms will be investing into research and development, it will lead to better quality, of course, for consumers. So things like maybe network in rural areas, it will improve this. Overall, consumers will receive better quality products, but then also with better quality products, it may lead to new production methods which are cheaper, which are more efficient. Therefore, we could see a combination of better quality products at lower prices, which both, of course, would improve consumer welfare, improve consumer surplus. This is why I emphasize past paper practice. Absolutely perfect, a really good chain of analysis to practice, and one that is really likely to come up in some perspective in your exam. But now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. And of course, just before we move on, of course, I've just been focusing more on the chain of analysis here. Make sure to use the extracts, include as much real world application as possible. Of course, when I was speaking, I was giving a bit more like include the examples of the real firms, include a few stats and figures, use the extracts. Of course, it's 50-mark question. You have the benefit of the extracts to use it to boost that application mark, to make sure you're hitting the highest levels for those application marks. Okay, so first things first, we ended the chain of analysis by talking about how these firms can, even though they're losing demand, they can still invest, the incumbent firms, they can still invest the remaining supernova profit into research and development. But then you can argue, a really good evaluation point to argue, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which these firms can be dynamically efficient. As, for example, if these new firms, this new competition steals away most of these firms' demand, thus their profits are really low, it will therefore mean they don't have much money to allocate to research and development, thus meaning that they won't be able to be very dynamically efficient, thus meaning, of course, it would reduce the long-run benefits for consumers, such as better quality and lower prices. You could really argue, however, in evaluation, you could even say this depends on the degree of competition, or you could say this depends on the degree of dynamic efficiency by incumbent firms. With regards to our second evaluation point, it's very much to do with the question, and what is the main aim, what is the main thing we're addressing in the question, which of course would be protecting consumers. The policy we've suggested to help protect consumers would be deregulation. But now let's think back to why this regulation was in place originally. Of course, the reason why this regulation was instated originally by the government would be something along the lines of trying to protect firms and trying to protect consumers. So by us removing the regulation, the way you can evaluate this by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether deregulation may actually harm consumers. As for example, it could lead to lower quality for consumers, and it could lead to like things like unsafe practices. For example, firms might start cutting corners. It may lead to firms that shouldn't really be in the market, who maybe don't have the capital, who don't maybe produce the quality that was usually required by regulation to produce. They could now enter the market, and in the end, who does it affect? In the end, it's going to affect consumers. Maybe in this scenario, it's going to lead to unreliable networks, maybe instability, where since there's not much regulation in the market, new firms enter the market, they become established, and they're not run well, and they leave instantly, thus meaning that consumers have to constantly switch networks. And overall, these would of course lead to worsening consumer outcomes. So deregulation is always a bit of a tricky one whether to pursue or not, since of course there is a reason why this regulation was originally instated, and it was originally instated for the reasons to protect consumers. So by removing it, a massive consequence could actually be at least to harm for consumers rather than benefit, like we suggested in the paragraph. And of course, you can mention how other policies could be more effective. Things like stopping anti-competitive practices, demerger policy could work better than something like deregulation. But yeah, there's lots of different evaluation points here. Even things like we mentioned in the last paragraph, government failure, the degree of government failure, short run versus long run, think about the time frame. Lots of different evaluation points here that you can focus on into. But that is where I'm going to wrap it up for this 15-mark question. That is section B for this 2019 paper 1 done. And let's now move on to the section C, the 25-mark question.